This is the Apocrypha of Azazel podcast, and I am Azazel, the god of death. I'm continuing to read through my journals, and we're on book 2, which is called The War of the Ghast. Today I will read to you chapter 14, which is titled The Valkyrie. It's additional information about some of the backstory about how Hacktor Derkillez became king. And it covers a 10-year time period, the years 290 to 299 after Oz. Shall we begin? And so, as you know, Hacktor Derkillez became the cone-haired Drokka of the Rocky Mountains. I can sense what you're thinking. I mean, who cares about another miscellaneous human figurehead, right? After all, your history is littered with them. But you see, that thinking is misguided. For Hacktor Derkillez was different, because Hacktor Derkillez was mine. Oh, sure, Merkur, Heracles, and Hekla, they all thought they were responsible for Hacktor's rise to power, and each of them believed they could influence Hacktor to do what they wanted. I let them think that way. But in reality, I was the one pulling the strings on the puppet that was the great Hacktor Derkillez. In fact, a few tidbits of history may help you to understand why Hacktor was so important. Recall that after nearly 70 years of growing fat and lazy under the do-nothing king Balder, the Drokka people were ripe for the picking. After the Twin Towers fell, the Drokka populace was in a panic. Their rivals, the Drokka, who had a bigger population and far more resources, could easily have swooped in and exterminated the Drokka, if only the Drokka had the balls to venture into the caves to root the Drokka out. Now, I knew all along that this would never be a realistic possibility. So my plan was always to bring the Drokka out of their safe havens and make them accessible to the Drokka. Back when my rival Roki was watching over them, even though the Drokka armies were 1/10 the size of their rivals, the cave dwellers were a fearsome force, and since gaining their freedom, the Drokka had launched countless wars against their former slave masters over the centuries. I witnessed 3 purification wars that lasted 50-plus years. I saw 60 years of Drokka death wars, and even a 45-year period titled the War of the Rokia, which had turned the Drokka into little killing machines. Their skills, superior weapons and armor, and jihadist belief had always given the Drokka an edge over the more "I'll fight when it's convenient for me" Drokka people. Had their god Roki stuck around to continue helping them, the Drokka would likely have been the ones to wipe out the Drokka. But as you know, Roki abandoned his people so he could go off in search of love with Gaia. And that left the door open for Gwar to take part in openly backing the Drokka people. And this eventually turned the tide against the Drokka. But you know all this, right? I mean, it's ancient history. Recall that this was the scene I came back to when I returned from Illusia after first learning about the magical dagger named Dagall, the weapon that was allegedly destined to destroy me. After pondering my options, I realized the whole Drokka-Drokka rivalry offered me an opportunity to not only feed my ever-hungry soul with more souls, but also to get some information about Gwar's knowledge of Dagall without the brute knowing about it. Now, not wanting Gwar to get in my way, I had to do something to get him away from the scene for a while. And that's where my idea for Baldur's peace treaties first came up. It wasn't easy to change the mindset of the warmongering Drokka at first, but money cures a lot of things. I therefore made sure that Baldur's plan succeeded, and that his trickle-down politics impacted the common people too. Well, at least enough to give them a taste of the finer things in life. The result was that most of the Drokka abandoned their desire for war. After all, who wants to fight when you can sit at home and drink and smoke and whore without expending any efforts? This eventually caused the Drokka armies to dwindle in size, and they lost their skills. And for nearly 70 years, this became the new Drokka's way of life. Oh, I kept a small faction inside the community focused on their historical goals, otherwise known as the 3 R's, a religion, the Ragnarok, and Vroki. But most of the people only paid lip service at church after Baldur's secular success had made them rich. And so the degradation of society continued. Just as importantly, without wars to hold his interest, Gwar, the god of war, grew bored with the Terverde continent and went in search of greener pastures. You'll recall that he then traveled across the Aravan Ocean and to the lands of Ora. And that's when it was finally time to move the process forward on my end. After the fall of the twin towers of the Seek and the death of their beloved King Baldur in the beginning of the year AO 299, the Drokka people were terrified. Although they still had an army and lots of little generals running around, the current generation had long since lost its confidence in their abilities. Getting them to take action required the presence of a strong commander with a dynamic personality. Think somebody like Julius Caesar or Napoleon from your modern-day periods. Someone with the willpower to change the world. That person for the Drokka people was Hacktor Derkillez. After all, he'd been groomed for this moment his entire life. Hacktor's sole purpose was to start a war such that the world had never seen. For remember, that fit well with my plans. Oh, I suppose that I may have pushed Hacktor a teensy bit, but ultimately the choice was his. For, like you, Hacktor too had free will. Therefore, the decision to make war, and the tragic results that occurred for his people, had to fall squarely on Hacktor's shoulders, and I take no responsibility for what happened. Now, like most religion, the Drokka faith was bogged down with bureaucracy, corruption, and more man-made rules than you could count. But at its core, the Drokka religion was meant to help the people understand their reason for existence in this world. And in that regard, it failed miserably. Pretty much like all your human religions have failed. Now, recall that 800 years prior to Hacktor's time, the Drokka people initially worshipped the god of their forefather Cain. That would be my made-up deity, Baal. Back then, the Drokka also lived in relative harmony with their Dirk brothers, since you'll recall that both had a common enemy in the form of the rival clans of the man Szeth, all of whom traced their lineage back to Adam and Eve. You'll recall that in Book 1, The Great Deceiver, I told you how my made-up deity Baal had promised Cain and his sons a promised land they could call their own, and that Baal had commanded his people to migrate to the west. Cain and his sons Drok and Dirk and their people did so, and eventually crossed an ancient and now sunken land bridge that allowed them to settle in the western lands of the continent of Terverde. As you also know, unfortunately things didn't quite work out as expected for the man Cain. The quote-unquote marked man didn't get what he wanted, or what he was promised by Baal, namely, that his mark of immortality would be removed. Cain also didn't get his second choice, that would be death. Instead, the unfortunate immortal abandoned his sons and their clans and wandered off to the wildlands of Terverde. Now, the place where the Drokka and the Drokka settled was a land they called Gore, and it was beautiful. And while the land had more than enough space to accommodate both clans, I had Baal inspire Dirk and his sons to want to control all of it for themselves. And I had prepared for this eventuality during their migration by having favored Dirk's clans with a higher birth rate, both among the humans and the livestock. Therefore, Dirk's people far outnumbered Drok's people by the time the clans had reached Gore, and the Dirk people had greater wealth and possessions. It therefore wasn't hard for Baal to convince the Dirks of the benefits of enslaving their brothers.
Why share when you can have
so, soon finding themselves in a strange land, without freedom and feeling abandoned by the only god they'd ever known, the enslaved Drokka's faith in Baal was shattered. And to further ensure that this would happen, I also had the Drokka priest murder all of the Drokka priests by advising the Drokka priests that they had to ensure their worship of Baal was kept pure. And so you have another example of murder in the name of religion. But that's another story. For a time, the Drokka people tried worshipping the mystery that was their patriarch Cain. But as he too had abandoned them, this faith didn't stick. Abused and beaten, during the time of their captivity, the Drokka searched for answers. Eventually, a new quasi-religion emerged, one that attempted to explain the mysteries of life with a host of foolish concepts, and in that regard it was thus similar to most other human religions. One of these mysteries was the concept of the Valkyries. For all intents and purposes, the primary motif associated with the Valkyries was their role as the deciders of fate for a person, or in this case, an entire people. Now, in part, the Drokka's Valkyries were similar to later archetypes like the Parse, the Norns, the Morai, and countless other mysterious weavers of fate. You know, those faceless, immortal, illusory beings who you people foolishly believed could control the threads of time. However, the Drokka took things a few steps further. As their religion developed, the Valkyries took on a greater form and function, eventually morphing into powerful immortals who had specific personas. High Valkyries were essentially the gods. Over time, Roki became the chief among them. And given that my rival had helped the Drokka secure their freedom, I suppose I shouldn't have been surprised by this. Additionally, certain high-achieving Drokka were posthumously proclaimed to be immortal by Drokka priests and scribes as a result of their recognition as Valkyries after their death. Among them were Ajax the Freemaker, Volsung the Fearless, the great poet Snorri Sturluson, and more. You can read the Drokka Chronicles for a full list. As the Drokka religion continued to take shape over the centuries, their people came to believe that even a living person might be considered a Valkyrie too, particularly if they were born with something called the Mark of the Valkyrie. Although in reality this mark was often nothing more than a common birthmark that Drokka priests could use to satisfy greedy, forward-thinking royals into believing that their children were special, and thus securing major donations to the church for its guidance. But with Hacktor, things were different. First off, I personally gave him his distinctive mark. Secondly, I had the high priest Merkur primed to recognize that identifying Hacktor as a Valkyrie would serve the priest's own designs, namely by giving Merkur control over a future king. Therefore, Merkur would feel like he was orchestrating events to suit himself, i.e. that he would get the Ragnarok he so lusted for. I suppose it also didn't hurt that old Merkur got to satisfy his sexual appetites by making young Hacktor his beloved as well. And finally, by this time in their religious development, the Drokka faith required that Valkyries, especially royal ones like Hacktor, spend their formative years under the tutelage of wise ones. In Hacktor's case, that was Merkur, and this allowed me to use Merkur to indoctrinate Hacktor on a daily basis. Additionally, one of the most important beliefs about Valkyries that I just loved and therefore helped grow was that a Valkyrie could talk to the gods, and there was no better place to talk to the gods than the Well of Wyzdom. What's that? You want to know if the Well of Wyzdom still exists? Alas, modern man has yet to discover it, and I'm not about to just give you the keys to the kingdom there. I will tell you this much, though. Remember that the Well of Wyzdom was located at Iztok, and Iztok was 2 kingdoms south of the high court at Roki Pass. Iztok was, and still is, in the heart of the Rockies, that mountain range that still cuts the continent of Terre Verde in two. Therefore, if you simply figure out where modern-day Roki Pass is, and then locate Iztok, you've got more than enough information to find this archaeological treasure. If you dare. Now, the well was really nothing more than a seemingly bottomless pit that had been discovered a couple centuries prior to Hacktor's time during a period of Drokka expansion throughout the Rockies. It was soon discovered that the pit made unusual sounds. Now, these sounds were in reality due to rather common geologic phenomenon, but as nobody at that time could explain these ominous noises, the opportunistic Drokka priests took it upon themselves to offer a religious solution, ascribing the pit's strange music to be the voices of the gods, and claiming that only Drokka priests could interpret those voices. Thus was born the Well of Wyzdom. The location of the well led to the establishment of a religious capital in what would later become the city of Iztok. With the birth of Iztok, and commands soon pouring forth from the well, the Drokka's religion exploded, and in time, wise ones became almost as powerful as cone hairs. And by the time Merkur had emerged on the scene, I had him wondering why a wise one such as himself, one who had been so loyal to the Drokka's faith, was in fact not more important than a secular king such as Baldur, who posed a real threat to the future of the religion and its stated goals. Of course, the answer as to why Baldur was still more important than Merkur was because Baldur had made the people rich. And remember, money is a cure for everything, right? In any case, when wise ones like Merkur spoke, the people listened. Well, the common people did at least. Again, Baldur and most of the other men of society paid little attention to Merkur. They let the priest spew out his dogma to help keep the people in line because it served their own purposes too. Enter Hacktor. Once I got Hacktor under Merkur's control, it wasn't hard to move him along his journey, particularly because I had long since taken over as the voice of the spirit of the well. Given that Hacktor was a royal Valkyrie, and that he was Merkur's beloved, Hacktor was given access to the well more than anyone save Merkur himself, and that meant I could speak to Hacktor directly. Oh, Merkur was still kept in the loop, because the priest believed he helped Hacktor to interpret what the boy learned from the well, but in reality it was my interactions with Hacktor that decided the course of the Drokka's fate. Wait, did I just admit that? Well, what about free will? Oops. Over the years of Hacktor's time in Iztok, I had numerous conversations with him as the spirit of the Well of Wyzdom. Many were about his father, and my goal was to get the prince to understand that although the Drokka people as a whole may have loved his father, it was hard to argue that Baldur had done anything to advance the station of his clan, for nothing of significance had occurred during his reign. Here is one such discussion that happened while Hacktor was about 15.
Tell me, what about Baldur the Third, king under the mountains? Proclaimed as great in the chronicles. What glory did he bring to the Drokka?
The boy did not reply. As usual, he was too overawed by the well's experience. And so my spirit continued on, for I wanted Hacktor to understand that he could achieve bigger and better things than his excuse for a father.
It's true that Baldur the Bold enjoyed peace during his reign. The chronicles also know a few others who ruled during peaceful times. But can you even tell me their names, boy?
Again, Hacktor remained silent.
That's okay, for I do not care for you to name them. Like those do-nothing cone hairs, Baldur will soon be forgotten when he passes away. But what about you, Hacktor? Do you want your reign to be remembered? Nay, more than just remembered. Do you want your reign to be legendary? Do you want to be mentioned with the forgotten Baldurs of history? Or the Agences, the Volsungs? Or do you want to be greater still?
Hacktor stuttered to reply. It's...
Hush, Hacktor. You have the chance to be different. The name Hacktor Derkillez can be remembered by
At last young Hacktor found his voice. "What is my desire?"
To be known as the Conehair Drokka, who was not just a part of history, but who changed it forever.
And then it was that I took Hacktor, in spirit form, on a little journey. First I showed him a vision of himself sitting at a grand banquet, surrounded by a cornucopia of wealth, and untold numbers of rabid supporters, as I said,
You shall not live on bread alone. When you rule, the world will be yours and all that is in it.
Next I took Hacktor to the top of the Seek Towers, and I opened his mind so that he could see all the kingdoms of Terre Verde, as I said.
Because you are like me, nay, because you are me, I will give you all their authority and splendor, for it is mine, and I can give it to anyone I want to. If you worship me, nay, if you worship us, all that you see will be yours.
I could see the boy was in shock at this, and that's when I laid my coup de grace.
Know this also, great Hacktor Derkillez. Even should you throw yourself down from the Seek, no harm will ever befall you, for I shall command the Valkyries to guard you. They will lift you up in their hands, so that you will not so much as strike your foot against a stone, for you are a god. You need only believe in me for all of this to come true.
At last Hacktor smiled, and it wasn't just the smile of a teenager, but that of a confident king. Thus I knew that I had him completely. And so, finished with my temptations, I left Hacktor until a more opportune time. Now, because of Hacktor's grooming, as soon as he became Conehair in the year AO 299, Hacktor began planning an offensive war, laying the groundwork for an apocalypse so grand that it would carve his name in history for all time. For the time was now right to make war again, and Hacktor was the right man for the job. You may be wondering, why was Hacktor so confident that he would succeed when his people were so pitiful by this time? Well, it's simple, really. Unlike past kings, Hacktor not only had the backing of the Drokka faith, but more importantly, he also had unmatched firepower on his side, in the form of the Ghast, the first weapon of mass destruction your world had ever seen. I'll never forget the day when I first spoke to Hacktor about the Ghast. It was towards the end of the year AO 298, about 9 months before Hacktor would become king. His father Baldur was still Conehair. Thus Hacktor was frustrated beyond compare because Baldur had not taken his advice to protect the twin towers of the Seek, and instead had merely dismissed Hacktor's concerns about the priory of the Miz as unsubstantiated conspiracy theories. Thus the prince felt that the kingdom was being compromised, and Baldur was jeopardizing the safety of the Drokka people. Now, because Hacktor was a Valkyrie, tradition required him to return to the Well of Wyzdom at Iztok at least twice a year. This gave Hacktor an outlet to escape his father, and gave me the chance to move things forward again. During the time of Hacktor, the Well of Wyzdom was in the center of a small cavern, itself deep within the mountains. Before Hacktor entered the Well of Wyzdom, Merkur was advising him, and the old priest was nearly giddy with emotion in a way that Hacktor had never seen him act before.
Today you shall finally see the spirit in the flesh. Even I have not had that privilege, boy, for I am not a Valkyrie. Yet I do know this. Soon you shall be Conehair. The spirit has told me so. It has shown me secrets. Amazing secrets about what is in store for you. And now the time is right. The spirit wants to reveal itself to you this very day. Are you ready, boy?
Yes! Hacktor could barely contain himself, so jacked up was he by Merkur's effervescence.
And dost thou remember the rules?
I shall remain here alone, praying to the gods. I am to kneel prostrate before the well and wait for the spirit to arrive. In addition to revealing itself to me, the Great Spirit will delve into my soul and read my destiny. Whatever is spoken to me is not to be revealed, except to you. And when I finish, I am to ring the bell of conclusion. Merkur didn't reply to Hacktor's words. Instead, the wrinkled mage affixed Hacktor with a critical eye, and the old man's gaze bored into Hacktor's soul. And then Merkur laid a bony hand on the prince's shoulder, pinching the bigger man's muscles with a vice-like grip, attempting to dominate the would-be king.
You must tell me everything, Hacktor. Everything. Do not forget. I won't be able to help you interpret the spirit's knowledge unless you tell me all that has occurred. Without my help, you will waste this opportunity. Do you understand, boy?
Hacktor looked away and said, "May I begin?"
Indeed,
Merkur nodded, and then walked away himself, mumbling under his breath as he exited the room, yet finally leaving Hacktor alone to enter the well. Incense continually filled the room that housed the well and coated everything in a hazy shade. When Hacktor first arrived in the room, he hesitated, unsure of what to expect, afraid perhaps at what the spirit might look like, or worse yet, what it might find within his soul. But soon enough, Hacktor took his place and kneeled at the base of the Well of Wyzdom. With his forehead pressed against the cold stone, Hacktor could soon hear a trickle of water off in the distance. Meanwhile, the incense continued to force its way into his lungs, and even though he closed his eyes, still they began to water profusely. In fact, the longer Hacktor lay prostrate, the more the room seemed to fill with the herb-infused smoke. Coughing, the man wondered how long he could keep this up, for by now his lungs felt as if they were being pierced with glass shards. Soon the pain became unbearable, and was growing worse by the moment. Yet still Hacktor struggled to remain in place and to remain kneeling.
Deliver me!
Hacktor gasped at last, his lungs ripping with each word. Finally, he looked up and saw. "Arise, my child," a voice called from the well. I could see that Hacktor was surprised at who he saw, for even though Merkur had long been preparing Hacktor for this day, I knew that the soon-to-be king was expecting someone else. For Hacktor had long assumed that the spirit he had been talking to over the years would surely turn out to be the god Roki. But he secretly hoped that it might actually be he who has no name. The made-up creator god of the Drokka whom few had ever seen, read none, and whom no one had ever described. Although legends within the Drokka chronicles that Hacktor knew about said that both Ajax and Volsung had seen the creator god during their visits to the well, Hacktor didn't know this was a lie, and obviously then Hacktor was hoping that it would be the same for him, but instead Hacktor saw me. Immediately, Hacktor bowed before my presence. "Shadu Mazai." "My lord?" Recall that Shadu Mazai is the name the Drokka gave me as the god of death in their religion. "You were expecting someone else?" I laughed, the robes of my black hood combining with the mists of the well to conceal the skeletal features of my faith. "Do you want me to leave you?" Hacktor's throat constricted, but he managed to eke out, "No, please, stay. Please, share your knowledge with me, my lord." "Oh, I'll do more than that, great Hacktor, for I've come bearing gifts." And before him I caused there to appear the image of the great gleaming battle axe, the Ghast. Hacktor jumped back at the apparition as it glowed in a hazy light. It was a long while before he found his tongue. What is it?" "With this blade, great Hacktor, you shall deliver your people." And I could see my words cut him to the core. I shall tell you how to forge countless copies of this blade. Although not as powerful as your own, you can arm your people with the copies and then make war upon your rivals. And when you do, all that you desire shall be yours. Blackwood Forest, untold riches, your name carved into every rock in the Rockies. Hacktor Derkillez will thus be remembered for all eternity as the greatest Conehair of all. For such is my covenant with you, Hacktor, and it shall stand with all time. The ego-driven prince smiled at my proposal and reached his hand forward, intent on grabbing the ghast, only to be disappointed when it disappeared into the mist. What happened? Relax, Hacktor. I've shown you naught but an image. But fear not, great Conehair. The ghast awaits you with its maker. Who? Where? Hacktor wondered at first, but then he answered his own question. There can only be one with the knowledge to create such a blade. Hephaestus. Indeed, I replied. Seek him out. Take hold of your destiny, Hacktor Derkillez. Now I should pause here, because little did I know that by sending Hacktor to the weaponsmith Hephaestus, I was not only signing Hacktor's death warrant, but my own as well. It's a problem I would have to deal with much later, but I didn't know it at the time. In any case, the remainder of my conversation with Hacktor was not important, nor the details of the day, how or when I left Hacktor alone again, him ringing the bell of conclusion, or even how he got out of the well. I can tell you, though, that Merkur was immensely pleased to learn about Hacktor's vision of a weapon of power. In fact, Merkur already knew about the ghast because I had previously arranged matters such that after Hephaestus had finished making the blade, tradition required the weaponsmith to consult the Wise One to have that mage read the runes and advise Hephaestus who to offer the gift to. Naturally, this tradition of reading the runes had been installed long ago at my direction in preparation for just this occurrence. And so it was that Hephaestus had visited Merkur about a month before I told Hacktor about the ghast. Upon hearing about Hef's creation, Merkur dutifully read the runes and, not surprisingly, instructed Hef to gift the ghast to Hacktor Derkillez, the future Conehair Drokka of the Rockies. Thus it was that Merkur already knew that Hacktor would receive the ghast. He just didn't know exactly when. Now, given Hacktor's revelation about the ghast from the Spirit of the Well, the Wise One quickly advised the prince to travel to Kel Dekaba with all haste to retrieve his prize from Hephaestus.
The Ragnarok is at hand, my boy, Merkur averred to Hacktor. Obtain the blade and take hold of your destiny.
What Merkur didn't tell Hacktor was that the Priory of the Miz's plans were also moving forward behind the scenes, and that Conehair Baldur was about to be murdered, which meant that Hacktor would soon be made king. Merkur kept that knowledge to himself to maintain some control over Hacktor. For Hacktor being given the ghast at this time was critical for the long-term success of Merkur's own plans, and seeing things come together so nicely, the old priest was amazed. Before Hacktor left his presence, he reminded the young prince,
Roki works in mysterious ways. Many are the plans of a man's mind, but it is the Lord who directs his steps, Hacktor. Challenge not the Drokka.
For Rocky is our god, Hacktor smiled. And so it came to pass. Hacktor was destined to possess a weapon of mass destruction, and Baldur or no Baldur, once Hacktor got his hands on this weapon, he was intent on using it. In the meantime, I encourage you to go to my website, apocryphaofazazel.com, and sign up to join my free book club. Not only will you get notified when new chapters are released, but if you can't wait, you can read every chapter of this book online right now. So go to apocryphaofazazel.com. Until next time, my friends, this is Azazel saying, don't call for me. I very well may show up.